August 7, 1944, 2:47 p.m., near Mortagne, Normandy, France. The afternoon sun beats down mercilessly on the rolling hills of Normandy. Dust rises from the dry earth as the rumble of diesel engines echoes through the narrow country roads. Inside the cramped, sweltering hull of an M4 Sherman tank, Sergeant James Rothwell of the 3rd Armored Division wipes sweat from his forehead. His crew hasn't slept in 36 hours. Through the periscope, he spots movement along the tree line, about 800 yards out. A dark silhouette emerges from the shadows, low and predatory. His gunner, Corporal Martinez, sees it too. "Panther," he whispers, his voice tight with fear. Every American tanker knows what that means. The German Panther tank, with its sloped armor and devastating 75mm gun, is a mechanical apex predator. Allied intelligence has drilled it into their heads. One Panther can take out 5 Shermans before going down. The math is simple and brutal. But today, something different is about to happen. Something that will shake the foundations of German armored doctrine and rewrite what everyone thought they knew about tank warfare. If you want to discover how American ingenuity and tactical brilliance turned the tables on German engineering superiority, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us which World War II battle you want us to cover next. Your support keeps these untold stories alive. The Sherman tank has become a symbol of American industrial might, but also of Allied sacrifice. Nicknamed the Ronson by British crews after the cigarette lighter that lights first time. Every time, the M4 Sherman had a reputation for burning when hit. German tankers called them Tommy Cookers or Zippos. Cruel testament to how often they went up in flames. The statistics were grim in the Bocage country of Normandy during the first weeks after the American armored divisions reported catastrophic losses. Some tank companies lost 70 to 80% of their vehicles in a matter of days. The German tanks, the Panther, the Tiger, even the updated Panzer, IVS seemed invincible by comparison. But Sergeant Rothwell's story, and thousands like it, tell a different tale. One that German commanders struggled to accept, even as their vaunted Panzer divisions crumbled across France and later in Germany itself. This is the story of how the Sherman tank, dismissed by many as inferior, became the weapon that broke the back of German armored forces. It's a story not of superior engineering, but of superior thinking, not of thicker armor, but of smarter tactics, not of individual duels, but of overwhelming, coordinated Kombindarms warfare that the Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, could never fully counter. The myth of invincibility. To understand how the Germans could be so shocked by their own defeat, we need to go back to the beginning of the war. In 1939 and 1940, German panzer divisions revolutionized warfare. The concept of blitzkrieg lightning war-combined tanks, motorized infantry, and close air support into a devastating combined arms force that overran Poland in weeks and France in just 6 weeks. The world watched in horror and awe as German armored columns punched through defensive lines that were supposed to be. The early German tanks weren't particularly impressive on paper. The Panzer I and II were a little more than training vehicles pressed into combat service. Even the Panzer III and IV, which became the backbone of German armored forces in the early war years, were modestly armed and armored. What made them deadly wasn't their individual superiority, it was how they were used. German doctrine emphasized speed, coordination, radio communication, and concentration of force at the decisive point. While French and British tanks were often superior in armor and armament, they were scattered across the front in small packets, supporting infantry. The Germans concentrated their armor into independent divisions that could exploit breakthroughs and race deep into enemy territory, causing chaos and collapse. By 1943, however, something had changed. The Soviet T-34 had appeared on the Eastern Front in 1941, and it shocked German commanders. With its sloped armor, wide tracks, powerful engine, and excellent 76mm gun, the T-34 was superior to anything Germany fielded at the time. The German response was swift and technologically impressive. They developed the Panther tank, which entered service in weighing 45 tons. With frontal armor up to 120mm thick and a high-velocity 75mm gun that could penetrate any Allied tank at long range, the Panther was a formidable machine. Then came the Tiger I, weighing 54 tons. With 100mm of frontal armor and a legendary 88mm gun that could destroy Allied tanks from distances exceeding 2 kilometers, German propaganda and their own tactical successes created an aura of invincibility around these machines. In Tunisia, in Italy, and in the first weeks after D-Day, Tigers and Panthers proved devastating. At Villars-Bocage on June 13, 1944, a single Tiger commanded by SS Obersturmführer Mikhail Wittmann ambushed a British armored column, destroying approximately 14 tanks and 15 other vehicles in just 15 minutes before withdrawing. Such stories spread like wildfire through both Allied and German ranks. The numbers seemed to support German confidence. A Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman at 1,500 meters. A Sherman's standard 75mm gun could barely scratch a Panther's frontal armor, even at point-blank range. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, while the Sherman needed to get within 200 meters and hit the Tiger's side or rear armor to have any chance of a kill. German tank crews began to feel almost invulnerable, particularly when fighting from defensive positions where they could engage at long range. The American response: quantity and quality, but the Germans fundamentally misunderstood what they were facing. The Sherman tank wasn't designed to win one-on-one duels with German heavy tanks. It was designed as a complete weapons system integrated into a common arms doctrine that the Americans had studied carefully from German successes and failures. The M4 Sherman entered service in 19... and by war's end, approximately 49,234 Shermans had been produced in various models. To put that in perspective, Germany produced about 6,000 Panthers and only 1,347 Tigers during the entire war. The Americans were producing more tanks in a month than Germany could produce in half a year. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about strategic thinking. American doctrine recognized that tanks would be lost in combat. The Sherman was designed to be easy to produce, easy to hit by ear, and easy to replace. It had a relatively simple design with interchangeable parts. Its gasoline engine was reliable and easy to maintain. Unlike the complex and temperamental Maybach engines in German tanks, the Sherman's mechanical reliability was extraordinary. When German tanks frequently broke down, the Panther had chronic transmission problems, and the Tiger was notorious for mechanical failure. Shermans could operate for extended periods with minimal maintenance. More importantly, the Sherman was designed with crew survivability in mind. It had excellent ergonomics, good visibility, spacious interior, and escape hatches that actually worked. German tanks, especially the Panther and Tiger, were cramped and difficult to escape from when hit. American crews could bail out quickly, and they often did, surviving to fight in another tank. This meant that experienced crew staff, most valuable asset in armored warfare, survived to pass on their knowledge and continue fighting. The Sherman also had something German tanks lacked: a stabilized gun. The gyroscopic stabilizer allowed the Sherman to fire accurately while moving, a huge advantage in fluid combat situations. German tanks had to stop to fire accurately, making them vulnerable during any advance. American crews learned to use this advantage, firing on the move to suppress German tanks while maneuvering into better positions. But perhaps the most important American advantage was the one German commanders consistently underestimated: combined arms integration. American armored divisions weren't just tanks. They were combined arms teams that included tanks, armored infantry, self-propelled artillery, tank destroyers, engineers, and crucially close air support. The American doctrine was never about tank versus tank duels. It was about using every available weapon system to overwhelm the enemy. The tactical revolution back in Normandy, Sergeant Rothwell's crew is about to demonstrate exactly how this works. The Panther is hulled down behind a hedge, only its turret visible. It's a perfect defensive position. Martinez, the gunner, knows he can't penetrate the front armor. Target bearing 270, Rothwell calls into the radio: Panther, hold down, moving to flank. What happens next takes less than 90 seconds, but illustrates years of tactical evolution. Rothwell, Sherman, and two others immediately begin moving, spreading out, and using the terrain for cover. They're not trying to charge the Panther head on. That would be suicide. Instead, they're fixing it in place, keeping it focused on their position. Meanwhile, Rothwell's platoon leader has already called for support within 30 seconds. A pair of P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers that had been on call orbiting nearby received the target coordinates. Artillery observers with the infantry call in a fire mission. A platoon of M10 tank destroyers, more lightly armored vehicles with powerful 3-inch guns, begins moving to the Panther's flank using a covered approach. The Panther crew sees the Shermans maneuvering and fires. The 75mm shell screams across the field and slams into the lead Sherman, penetrating clean through and killing the driver instantly. But the other two Shermans have already scattered and are returning fire, not to penetrate the Panther's armor, but to suppress the crew, keeping their heads down and limiting their ability to aim carefully. The Panther's commander, Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, a veteran of the Eastern Front, is confident. He's destroyed dozens of Soviet and American tanks. His crew is experienced, his machine is superior, but something feels different today. There are too many targets, too much movement, too much coordination. Then the artillery arrives, not aimed at the Panther directly, the American spotters know that wouldn't work, but at the hedgerows around it, cutting off escape routes and creating a killing zone. Panther starts to reverse, pulling back from its position. That's when the P-47s dive. Their .50 caliber machine guns can't penetrate the Panther's armor, but they don't need to. They strafe the engine deck, the thinner rear armor, and force the crew to button up, limiting visibility. More critically, they drop bombs in the Panther's path, one landing close enough that the concussion damages the track. Now the M10 tank destroyers arrive from the flank, and from 600 meters, they have a shot at the Panther's side armor. The first round penetrates just behind the turret ring. The second M10 fires 3 seconds later, hitting the rear deck. The Panther's ammunition cooks off, and the entire vehicle erupts in flames. Hartmann and 2 of his crew manage to escape, but they're stunned, disoriented. How did this happen? His tank was better, his crew was experienced, but they never had a chance to use their advantages. This scene played out thousands of times across France, Belgium, and Germany in 1944 and 1945. The Germans kept expecting tank-in-tank duels where their superior armor and guns would dominate. Instead, they faced a system of warfare they couldn't counter. Every time a Panther or Tiger destroyed a Sherman and they destroyed many, they immediately drew fire from artillery, air support, and flanking vehicles. German tanks rarely fought one. They fought 1 against 10 or 1 against 20, with half of those attackers not being tanks at all, but aircraft, artillery, or infantry with the numbers tell the story. The statistics from the European campaign are revealing, but they're often misunderstood. It's true that in direct tank versus tank combat, German armor had better kill ratio. A well-positioned Panther or Tiger could destroy multiple Shermans before being knocked out, but that's not how the war was fought, and it's not how battles were won. Consider the Battle of Ericourt in September 1944, one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front. The German 5th Panzer Army, with approximately 262 tanks, including 86 Panthers, attacked the U.S. 4th Armored Division, which had approximately 177 Shermans and similar numbers of other armored vehicles. German commanders were confident. Their Panthers had superior armor and firepower. They were attacking to relieve pressure on German forces and push the Americans back. The result shocked the German high command. Over 2 weeks of fighting, the Germans lost 281 tanks and assault guns, including the vast majority of their Panthers. American losses were 48 Sherman. The kill ratio was nearly 6-1 in favor of the Americans, the exact opposite of what German doctrine predicted. How was this possible? The answer lies in combat arms warfare and tactical flexibility. American commanders used their Shermans not as dueling weapons, but as mobile fire support platforms within a larger system. When Panthers appeared, American forces would do several things simultaneously. Fix the enemy tanks in place with suppressive fire, call in artillery and air support, maneuver flanking elements into position, and use superior numbers to overwhelm isolated enemy vehicles. The Germans, despite their technological superiority in individual tanks, couldn't coordinate effectively. Their communications were worse, their logistics were breaking down, their air support was nearly non-existent, and their doctrine was still focused on individual tank superiority rather than system-level integration. The same pattern repeated at the Battle of the Bulge in December 19. The Germans launched their last major offensive in the West with approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns, including significant numbers of Panthers, Tigers, and even the new King Tiger. Initial German successes were dramatic, exploiting bad weather that grounded Allied aircraft and achieving surprise. German tank columns drove deep into American lines, recapturing territory and surrounding entire American divisions. But once the weather cleared and American forces reorganized, the tide turned decisively. By January 1945, German forces had lost approximately 800 tanks and assault guns. American losses were comparable in absolute numbers, around 700, 800 tanks, but the strategic impact was completely different. American losses were replaced within weeks. New Shermans arrived from factories in Detroit. Crews were trained and ready. The Germans couldn't replace their losses. The Panthers and Tigers destroyed in the Ardennes were irreplaceable. The trained crews were irreplaceable. Germany's industrial capacity was crumbling under Allied bombing, and they were running out of fuel, spare parts, and trained personnel. From a purely statistical standpoint, American Sherman production was staggering. In 1944 alone, American factories produced approximately 17,000 M4 Shermans of various types. That's more than the entire German tank production for the entire war across all models. The United States was also producing 1,500 aircraft per month, thousands of trucks, unlimited artillery shells, and an avalanche of supplies. The Germans, by contrast, produced about 19,000 tanks total from 1943 to 1945 across all types, and many of these were immobilized by lack of fuel before ever reaching the front. The technical evolution, the Sherman wasn't static either. American engineers constantly improved it based on battlefield feedback, something the Germans struggled to do as their industrial capacity collapsed. The early M4A1 Sherman with the 75mm gun was indeed vulnerable to German armor at long range, but by late 1944, significant numbers of upgraded Shermans were reaching the front. The M4A3E8 Sherman, nicknamed Easy 8, featured improved suspension, wider tracks for better mobility, and most importantly, many were equipped with the new 76mm high-velocity gun. This gun could penetrate the side armor of Panthers and even the frontal armor at closer ranges. It wasn't as powerful as the German 88mm, but it dramatically changed the tactical equation. Now, Shermans could engage Panthers on more equal terms, especially when using specialized ammunition like HVAP high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. The British developed the Sherman Firefly, mounting the excellent 17-pounder anti-tank gun on the Sherman chassis. This weapon could penetrate any German tank from the front at combat ranges. The British doctrine was to hide Fireflies among regular Shermans in every troop, creating a nasty surprise for German tank crews. What looked like a standard Sherman might actually be carrying a gun that could kill a Tiger at 1,000 meters. German tank commanders learned to fear the Firefly's distinctive long barrel, but by then, the psychological damage was done. No longer could they assume superiority over every Sherman they encountered. Americans also fielded the M4A3E to Jumbo Sherm, with armor thickness increased to 178mm on the front, thicker than a Panther. While only about 250 Jumbos were produced, they served a crucial role in assault operations, leading attacks and absorbing hits that would destroy standard Shermans. In urban combat, where the range is closed and maneuverability mattered more than long-range gunnery, the Sherman's advantages became even more pronounced. Perhaps most tellingly, American crews became increasingly skilled and confident. The initial panic that German heavy tanks caused in Normandy gave way to professional competence and tactical sophistication. Crews learned to fight smart rather than fair. They learned to use terrain, to coordinate with infantry and artillery, to call in airstrikes, and to exploit German weaknesses. They learned that a Panther immobilized by a damaged track was just a pill, and a pillbox could be destroyed by infantry, artillery, or air power. They learned that German tanks were logistically fragile, often abandoned when they ran out of fuel or broke down rather than being destroyed in combat. The German perspective, disbelief, and adaptation for German tank crews and commanders. The reality of being outfought by Shermans was psychologically devastating. Their entire doctrine was built on technological and tactical superiority. From 1939 through 1942, they had dominated every opponent on the Eastern Front. Despite facing the excellent T-34 and KV-1, German crews had achieved enormous kill ratios through superior training, tactics, and coordination. Oberst Hans von Luck, a German regimental commander who fought from France in 1940 through to the end of the war in 1945, later wrote about the psychological impact of the Allied combat arms system. We expected to fight tank against tank, where our superiority would decide the battle. Instead, we faced an avalanche. When we destroyed one Sherman, two more appeared. When we engaged those, artillery fell in our positions. When we moved, their aircraft appeared within minutes. We couldn't fight the battle we had trained for. It wasn't that the Sherman was a better tank, it wasn't. But the Americans fought a better war. German after action. Reports from late 1944 and 1945 make for sobering reading. Commanders repeatedly express frustration and disbelief at their inability to achieve the decisive victories their technological advantages should have provided. A report from the 2nd Panzer Division in September 1944 notes, despite achieving favorable kill ratios in individual engagements, the division continues to lose combat effectiveness due to attrition, mechanical failures, and overwhelming enemy combat arms coordination. Enemy tactics of fixing our forces with frontal pressure while simultaneously employing our and air support have proven extremely difficult to counter. What particularly frustrated German commanders was the speed of American adaptation. Early in the Normandy campaign, American units sometimes panicked when encountering Panthers and Tigers, with inexperienced crews abandoning perfectly functional tanks when German armor appeared. But by August 1944, just 2 months later, American crews were fighting with confidence and sophistication. They had learned the terrain, understood their own capabilities and limitations, and developed tactics that worked. The famous German tank Ace Autocarius, who destroyed over 150 enemy tanks during the war, most of them Soviet, later reflected on fighting Americans. The Americans were different from the Russians. The Russians would attack with massive numbers, waves of T-34s that we could destroy, but never stop. The Americans wouldn't give us the tank battle we wanted. They would probe, withdraw, call in artillery, use air support, and maneuver. By the time we understood their plan, we were already surrounded or being hit from unexpected directions. Their individual tanks were inferior, but their system was superior. Some German units did adapt. They learned to fight more defensively, using their superior armor and guns to ambush American columns and then withdraw before the full weight of American firepower could be brought to bear. They learned to fight at night when American air superiority was needed. They learned to target American artillery observers and forward air controllers, trying to disrupt the coordination that made the American system so effective. But these were tactical adaptations that couldn't overcome strategic realities. By early 1945, German armored forces were shadows of their former strength. Fuel shortages meant that even functional tanks were often abandoned or used as static pillboxes. The new King Tiger, potentially the most powerful tank of the war, was frequently found abandoned on roadsides, out of fuel or broken down, never having fired a shot in anger. The Americans were finding intact Panthers in German maintenance depots, cannibalized for parts to keep other Panthers running for a few more days. The vaunted panzer divisions that had conquered Europe were now dispersed, understrength, and increasingly desperate. The final battles, the myth shattered. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 and the subsequent drive into Germany itself provided the final proof that German armored superiority was a myth. American armored divisions, spearheaded by Shermans, raced across Germany at speeds that rivaled the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. The 3rd Armored Division advanced over 300 miles in a few weeks, destroying or bypassing remaining German resistance in these final battles. The few remaining German Panthers and Tigers were increasingly fought by veteran American crews who knew exactly how to defeat them. The psychological edge was now completely with the Americans. German crews, many of them hastily trained replacements, knew they were facing experienced opponents with unlimited support. The Americans knew they had the upper hand. At the Battle of Cologne in March 1945, American Shermans engaged in urban combat, the most dangerous environment for armor. German Panther and Panzer IV tanks fought from prepared positions with good fields of fire. In one famous engagement captured on film, a Sherman from the 3rd Armored Division was ambushed by a Panther at close range. The Sherman was hit and disabled, but within minutes, the supporting American infantry had identified the Panther's position. Another Sherman maneuvered to flank it, and the Panther was destroyed. The entire engagement took less than 5 minutes. This was combat arms warfare at its most efficient, and German crews simply couldn't counter it anymore. The statistics from the final months of the war are overwhelming. From January to May 1945, German armored forces in the West effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. They lost thousands of tanks, most not to direct combat but to mechanical breakdown, lack of fuel, and abandonment as crews retreated on foot. American losses during the same period were relatively light, and every loss was immediately replaced. German commanders began surrendering with their units intact rather than face destruction. In Somikaze's entire panzer divisions with dozens of tanks surrendered without significant fighting, their crews recognizing the futility of continued resistance. The myth of German technological invincibility had been thoroughly shattered. Why the Sherman won? The real lessons. So how did the Sherman, a tank that was inferior in armor and firepower to its German opponents, helped win the war? The answer reveals fundamental truths about modern warfare that remain relevant today. First, reliability and sustainability matter more than peak performance. The Sherman worked. It didn't break down constantly like German tanks. It could be repaired in the field by ordinary mechanics. Parts were standardized and available. This meant that American armored divisions could sustain high operational tempos, keeping more tanks in the fight more of the time. German divisions, despite having superior individual tanks, often had less than half their nominal strength available due to mechanical breakdowns. Second, production capacity is a weapon system in itself. Building 50,000 good tanks beats building 6,000 great tanks. The Americans understood that numerical superiority, combined with adequate quality, would overwhelm individual technical superiority. They were right. German tank crews might destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before being knocked out, but there were always more Shermans, and replacement crews kept getting better, while German replacements were increasingly poorly trained. Third, combat arms integration is more important than individual platform superiority. The Sherman wasn't designed to fight alone. It was designed as part of a system that included infantry, artillery, air power, engineers, logistics, and intelligence. The Germans optimized for tank-to-tank combat and found themselves fighting a different war entirely. American doctrine recognized that modern warfare is about systems, not individual weapons, and they built their entire military around that principle. Fourth, crew, survivability, and training retention matter enormously. Sherman crews often survived hits that would have been fatal in tanks with worse ergonomics and escape hatches. These survivors went back into combat in new tanks, getting more experience with each battle. German tank crews, even when they survived, often had no new tanks to crew as production couldn't keep up with losses. The Americans could afford to lose tanks because they couldn't afford to lose crews. This calculus proved decisive. Fifth, strategic flexibility and rapid adaptation beat tactical rigidity. The Sherman's design allowed for rapid modification and improvement. The 76mm gun, improved armor, better engines, all were incorporated into production relatively quickly. The Americans constantly evolved their tactics based on battlefield experience. The Germans, trapped in a strategic situation that was increasingly hopeless, couldn't adapt fast enough. Their industry was being bombed, their resources were exhausted, and their tactical doctrine couldn't evolve to meet the reality of being overwhelmed on all fronts. Finally, logistics and operational reach matter more than tactical victories. A Panther might win an individual engagement, but if it ran out of fuel, ammunition, or spare parts days later and had to be abandoned, that tactical victory was strategically meaningless. The Americans had an uninterruptible supply line stretching back to factories in Detroit. Every German tank, every German gallon of fuel had to run a gauntlet of Allied bombing and partisan attacks. The Sherman could operate indefinitely with proper supply. German tanks increasingly couldn't. The human costs and legacy, we shouldn't romanticize this story. Thousands of American, British, and Canadian tank crewmen died in Shermans, often burned alive in the tanks that German crews mockingly called Tommy Cookers. For the men fighting at the sharp end, facing a Panther or Tiger was terrifying regardless of what the strategic calculus said. Many crews experienced the horror of seeing their friend's tank brew up after a German hit, knowing they could be next. Corporal Belton Cooper of the 3rd Armored Division's Maintenance Battalion later wrote a memoir titled Death Traps about his experiences recovering destroyed Shermans in Europe. His account is harrowing, describing fields littered with burned-out Shermans and the remains of their crews. He estimated that a Sherman crew had only a 50% chance of surviving the war if they remained in combat for the duration. These weren't just statistics, they were young men, many barely 20 years old, who climbed into their tanks each morning knowing the odds were against them. But those crews kept fighting because they understood something important. They were winning. Whatever the tactical challenges, whatever the losses, the strategic momentum was inexorably with the Allies. Every week brought more reinforcements, more supplies, more support. For German tank crews, the opposite was true. Every week brought fewer reinforcements, less fuel, less hope. By late 1944, experienced German tankers knew they were fighting a losing battle, that their technological advantages were meaningless against the tsunami of American material and the sophistication of Allied combined arms warfare. The Sherman's legacy extends far beyond World War II. It established principles of armored warfare that remained relevant in the 21st century. Reliability over peak performance, combined arms integration over individual superiority, sustainability over brilliance, and human factors over pure engineering. Modern military forces still grapple with these same traits. Is it better to have a small number of extremely capable but expensive platforms, or larger numbers of good enough systems that can be sustained in combat? The Sherman provides a clear answer. Both matter, but if forced to choose, sustainability and integration win wars. The M1 Abrams tank, America's current main battle tank, embodies many of the same principles as the Sherman. It's reliable, sustainable, designed for crew survivability, and intended to operate as part of a larger combat arms system. It's not trying to be invincible in one-on-one combats. It's trying to be part of a winning system. The lessons learned in Normandy, at Aracourt, in the Battle of the Bulge, and across Germany in 1945 remain embedded in American military doctrine today. Conclusion. The genius of good enough when German tank crews climbed out of their burning Panthers and Tigers, when they trudged into prisoner of war camps past endless columns of American Shermans rolling toward the front. Many genuinely couldn't understand what had happened. Their tanks were better. Their individual crews were often more experienced at the start of the campaign. Their tactical doctrine had conquered Europe. How had they lost? They lost because they were fighting the wrong war. They optimized for individual technical superiority in a war that was won by systematic integration, industrial capacity, and strategic sustainability. They built beautiful, powerful machines that required constant maintenance, consumed scarce resources, and couldn't be replaced when lost. The Americans built adequate machines that worked reliably, could be produced in overwhelming numbers, and formed part of a larger system that was greater than the sum of its parts. The Sherman tank wasn't the best tank of World War II by any technical measure, but it was exactly the right tank for the war that needed to be fought. It could be produced in numbers that made German production look trivial. It was reliable enough to keep fighting day after day. It was good enough to threaten German tanks when used properly, especially with the improved 76mm gun. It was sustainable enough to keep entire armies supplied and mobile across thousands of miles. And most importantly, it was designed to operate within a combat arms system that the Germans simply couldn't match. The Germans couldn't believe their tanks were outmatched by Shermans because they were measuring the wrong things. They were looking at armor thickness, gun penetration, and individual combat outcomes. The Americans were playing a different game entirely, one focused on systems, sustainability, and overwhelming coordinated power. In that game, the Sherman was the perfect piece, and the Germans never really understood the rules until it was far too late. The thunder of Sherman tanks rolling across Europe in 1944 and 1945 wasn't just the sound of military victory. It was the sound of a new kind of warfare, one where industrial capacity, systematic integration, and strategic thinking mattered more than individual tactical brilliance or technological superiority. The Germans learned this lesson too late. Modern military forces ignore it at their peril. If you found this story fascinating and want to explore more untold tales from World War II, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Your support helps us bring these incredible historical stories to life. What battle or event should we cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments. Below we read every single one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.